and then the lights went on. There's this note that gets slid under my door. And I was like, oh, they just wanted to know what it was like to be so independent. And I valued my choices and my freedom at that moment. I felt very lucky. I'm so glad that you could join me today. I'm talking about stories, my stories, as a professional belly dancer. My name is Suhaila Salimpour, and what a life. Okay, so the lights go out. And I had no sense of fear, actually. And I think when you work in nightlife and when you work in nightclubs, you develop this street smarts, this street instinct, this animal kind of ability to smell trouble. And I didn't, or you hope you are. You hope that you're building that kind of instinct. But I had no sense of fear at this moment, because then very softly and gently I felt his body press up against my body. And I kind of stepped back onto the wall, and it was silent. And I knew that the women were like protecting the door, but not because I was going to run out, but because of somebody coming in. And so his body pressed up against mine, and it's just pitch dark. And then I felt his kiss, and it was completely dark, but I knew that it was him. And because I had seen him come in through the door. And I remember just kind of surrendering to the situation and feeling the suit, the material on the suit, the very good quality. The suit, the quality of material was amazing. And I remember feeling his arms. And then as he pulled away, it was very gentle and respectful. He kind of stepped back, and then the lights went on. And then I was just kind of in shock and standing there staring at each other. And as fast as they all came in, it was like, and they were all out of the door. And I was just kind of left alone in the bathroom shaking. And it was the hottest kiss like ever. I mean, it was movie star moment kiss, right? And I was shaking, and I was like, how am I going to pull myself together? And oh my God, I hope the manager didn't see them come in. And what am I going to say? And I got to try to play this off. So I took a minute and I pulled myself together, and then finally I walked out nonchalant, and the manager comes running up to me, and I was like, oh no. And the manager goes, what did she say to you? And I went, who? And he rolls his eyes and goes, the princess. What did she say to you? And I go, what are you talking about? And he goes, I saw them all come in. The princess came in. What did she say to you? And I was like, oh, right. Just that she liked my show. Oh, okay. All right. It just seems so dramatic. Like her entourage came in, and then she came in, and then the entourage came out and she came out. I thought it was such a big deal. And I was like, yeah, no, it was nothing. Just that she likes the show. Okay, good. Yeah. She's been here every night, just making sure that, paying extra for you to come and dance after hours. And I'm like, okay, great. And I was like, oh my God. It was a princess the whole time. Best kiss ever, right? So then I go into my dressing room, and I'm just like trying to keep it together, because I'm just trying to keep it together. And so all of a sudden there's this note that gets slid under my door like that. And I open this note, And it's basically, will you join us, in our penthouse suite at this hotel, blah, blah, blah. And it had like kid vibes, like childhood vibes. And it was like us. And it was like, will you join the girls? And I thought, what is going on? This was like so, just the whole thing felt really unexpected. And I was kind of going with it. I was like, I'm always playing it safe. and my mama's not here with me tonight. And I'm going to go. I'm going to go to the penthouse. So I go after hours. I go to the penthouse, knock, knock, knock. And I open the door and they're all in their thopes, their long like house dresses. They're all relaxed, and they're running around and there's all this great food and tea and there's no alcohol and there's no drugs. It was not like that. It was they were just so happy to be together. And I saw them in their element, like they knew they weren't being watched because they all felt protected in their penthouse. And then they kind of whisked me. They all kind of grabbed me and brought me to this like chair of honor. This like, it was really a chaise. So there, trying to be cool, like last sitting on the chaise, and they were bringing me tea and sweets and so I'm there, and then they all sat around me on the floor, and they wanted to know if it was okay to ask me questions. And I thought, well, what would they possibly? Sure. And they just wanted to know what it was like to be so independent. And I thought, well, what do you mean? And they were like, well, how does it feel to drive? And I thought, well, it feels like a responsibility. And they're like, but, they all were learning how to drive, but it was illegal in their country to drive at that point. And so they were all driving like secretly and privately. And then when they got to this country, they would get to drive, but they didn't really have licenses, and they were nervous to drive because they weren't used to driving on streets with other cars. And I was like, right, like something I was completely taking for granted. And then they wanted to know what it was like to date or go on a date. And they didn't even mean like date, they meant like even have a choice to meet someone and go to dinner with them in public. Like that wasn't. And I remember thinking that what I was taking for granted as a Westerner and as a woman feeling kind of with the certain amount of rights that I felt that I had and that I was entitled to. And especially when I was in the States, I felt very protected as compared to times when I was a belly dancer living in the Middle East, and I felt that I had to have protection at times. I was shocked at how curious they were at basic things that we just take for granted, ideas of driving and what did it feel like to be able to. I was even asked like, well, what does it feel like knowing that you can choose your husband? And I thought, wow, right. And why did I become a belly dancer? And, okay, your mom was a belly dancer, but, your family allowed you to be a belly. And I thought, wow, all these things, and it was a very sweet moment. It was a very sweet night. And I was there for a few hours and they fed me really well. And then I wanted to go home and go to sleep. And they were just so happy to, hang out with me. And they felt very like they had their friend, like they got to get, I felt like I was in an interview, but it was like this exchange. And every time I'd answer them, I'd say, well, I feel for you, or I feel like it's a responsibility. They go, oh, and then they'd turn to each other and have this like dialogue. And a lot of times I didn't know what they were saying. A lot of it was in a Saudi Arabic, and that's an Arabic I'm not as I don't understand as much, especially when it's being spoken really fast. So yeah, it was one of those. And I just got in my car afterwards and they walked me down, and I got in my car, and actually I was handed an envelope which I was like, oh no, is it like directions to a new place? Is this like a 007 adventure? I had no idea, but they handed me an envelope and okay. And I took it and then I got home. And then when I opened the envelope, when I got home, it was a very large sum of money, which I thought was very interesting because I was just going to hang out. But they would have never expected to have my time without honoring me with without giving me a large sum of money. And we didn't even talk about it. But yeah, it was very interesting. And I felt really lucky at that moment because I felt, wow, I really am. I really, really am lucky. And I valued my choices and my freedom at that moment. I felt very lucky. So I think also what we as belly dancers not grapple with, but we're constantly in flux about is concepts and ideas of really which type of woman in society has freedom, which type of woman in society has protection, right? Which type of woman in society has the right to want protection or the right to, choices. Like I definitely feel that part of why the conversation with the Saudi princess and her friend group or her ladies in waiting was the curiosity of like what my life was like as a woman being able to make choices for myself. Like that to them was shocking. And then of course to me in my life and in my head, I felt restricted, so restricted in that I'm a belly dancer and I'm being looked at a certain way and I'm being treated a certain way. And so I feel like in my perception of myself, I feel restricted and feared. And I feel like also I have to, behave a certain way and act a certain way. And I'm also very nervous about how I'm going to be perceived by people that have contempt for me and contempt for what I represent. And this night was so beautiful because I knew that I had value and that my value also was just even being able to share my stories and that, that felt very hopeful to them because I didn't feel value. There were a few moments in my life where I felt fear, real fear, and no sense of value. And the interesting thing is one of them was on the airplane going to Lebanon to perform for the first time. And it was, of course, this moment, I'm going to Lebanon to perform. And, of course, we can get stuck into that fantasy of going to be a professional belly dancer. But the truth is, there's so much loaded in all of that. And it was right after the revolution, and Americans weren't allowed to go to Lebanon. There was no, visas. There was no allowing. And so what I was told to do was that you buy a ticket, you buy a ticket to Jordan. And then when you stop in Paris, you let them know that you really are going to go to Lebanon. And then they let you know if there's enough seats, because what you do is that when the plane stops in Jordan, you just don't get off. And I'm like, okay, so what you're telling me is I'm going to land in Jordan, but then I just don't get off the plane? And they're like, yes. I'm like, okay. And I couldn't believe I was doing this. And I couldn't believe that I was making this normal and that they were making, this is what we do. Okay, this is what you do. All right. So I land in Jordan, just like they said. Now I have my jeans on. I have my sweater on, I have my clogs on, I have my hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup on, but I made a big mistake. I was reading a book. I was something that's going to, I want to be riveted. So I was reading Princess. I don't know why, but I'm reading the book Princess, and I'm on my way to Lebanon, and I'm stopped in Jordan. So I've stopped in Jordan, and I'm sitting there kind of by myself in my own row. And I noticed that I'm really one of the only women on the plane at all, like at all. And definitely the only woman alone. And there were a couple other men by themselves. And then a bunch of families came on board, like, it looked like couples and husbands and wives. And, they all took their seats, and nobody came to tell me that I was in their seat. So I just sat there, and, we all got ready. The plane took off. So now we're going into Beirut. And I noticed after we leveled off that all the men, except for two, all the men on the plane took their shoes off. They got up out of their seats, and they walked almost like, in a file to the back of the plane. And I was very nervous about this. This was very scary to me. So after they all have their prayer beads in their hands, and there's me. And now I'm the only woman by myself. All the other women are sitting there, but they are obviously, they've just been left by their men. The men are in the back of the plane now all together. And I start to hear this like chanting, and it sounds very familiar because of course it's the chanting that my family used to do when they would pray. And I turn around and I look, and there's an imam sitting in the back of the plane in an open row. There was no seats in front, and all the men that had gone to the back of the plane were sitting on the floor in front of him on one knee, and they're rocking back and forth, and they're chanting the Quran. And he's reciting the Quran, the imam, and all the men are chanting. So to tell you that my body went into a cold sweat, I was just thinking to myself, why being a belly dancer? What was it about being a belly dancer that like wiped my common sense of what this means culturally? Like what's wrong here? And I became very nervous, and I thought, I had no idea what was to come. And this man that was sitting by himself, he kept looking over at me, and I didn't want to make eye contact with him. And he actually got up and he sat next to me, but there was, an aisle between us. And he leaned over and he started talking to me, and he said, "Let's just pretend we know each other. It'll be better for you." And I looked at him and I said, "Thank you so much." "Thank you. You're right." And he said, "You really shouldn't be alone." I was like, "Yeah, thank you so much." And so he talked to me on the plane as if we knew each other, and he asked me, like, why am I going to Lebanon, and why am I alone, and what? And he, had been living in Los Angeles and going to school in Los Angeles, and so he had an understanding of Western concepts, and he was going back to Lebanon to actually visit his family, and he did not live my side. That plane landed. Everybody, all the men went back to their seats. I sat down. The plane actually landed. Thank goodness. And as we were getting off the plane, he said to me, "You are not leaving my sight unless I know that you are taken care of and that you are actually in good hands." And I said, my friend is supposed to be picking you up, and what's his name? And I'm like, I know his first name. Anyway, my friend did pick me up, and I was in good hands. And the friend that picked me up actually they're from a very famous, well-known, established, respected family in Lebanon. And so I wasn't, and to him, I wasn't just being sent to the wolves. And so he felt okay letting me go, but he actually was also there to meet his family, and his fiance was there. And he was like, "You'll be coming and staying with us if you're left alone here." And it was at that moment where I thought, My level of, I don't even want to use the word trust, but if somebody like me who grew up in the culture and is from the culture could have such a disconnect to really what I'm walking into and what I'm, going into, what does that say about somebody that's not in the culture and actually has a fantasy about belly dance or a fantasy about the culture, and that's not something that they're a part of and that they want to talk about or that they want involved in their belly dance at all? Because something that I've really experienced and noticed a lot about the non-Middle Easterner involved in the belly dance experience is that belly dances for their fantasy life and belly dances for their little make-believe, getaway, feel-good, alternative, almost like that's their little vacation brain life. And don't mess with their fantasy either, because they only want to know a little about the reality of what it's like, but don't mess with their fantasy, because that's why they're in it.